James Short.
Just following on from what my colleague Dr. Kennedy-Graham was suggesting, then I'd like to introduce two further amendments. One of these is in my name, which is to amend the title of the bill so that the title would read, "This Act is the Climate Change Response (Removal of one Transitional Measure (Amendment Act 2016). It's been noted on a number of occasions during the debate that there are in place a number of transitional measures which are not being removed as a result of this bill, and so what we're suggesting is that a more accurate title for the bill would be that this is the removal of one transitional measure rather than all of them, or rather than several measures. And so if the government wasn't comfortable with that, I'd be happy to have that changed to removal of a transitional measure. The point is that it is a singular measure rather than a plurality of measures. And of course that it is a specific single measure, which is to remove the 1-for-2 subsidy and transitional measure under the emissions trading scheme. Related to that, Mr. Chair, I have a further amendment which is to change clauses 4, 5 and 8. And what that would do, if we were to do it as read, and I'm happy to read it out, is that it would, instead of phasing in the removal of the 342, that it would essentially bring it back to its original start point, which is that it would simply happen immediately. So that the 2-for-1 deal would be removed immediately rather than get phased in over the course of 3 years. And I know that there have been a number of very similar speeches tonight about how it's pragmatic and reasonable and responsible and some other adjectives to phase it in because of the woeful burden apparently that business will have to suffer as a result of removing the 2-for-1 deal. But of course what we know is that removal of the 2-for-1 deal will carry a total cost to the economy of 0.1% of GDP. I think it was said that it's essentially a day of 8 hours of productivity. In other words, we can all take a day off for climate change. If we were to remove it immediately, that would mean that 8 hours of productivity would carry that cost immediately, rather than a third of that each year, which is I guess just under 2.5 hours per year. So it is a minor cost. And the reason why I'm suggesting it is because of the urgency with which we need to act on climate change, because we have done nothing about it for 2.5 decades. It's been 24 years since the introduction of the United Nations Framework Convention. We have been negotiating globally more than half my entire life about what to do about climate change, and we came up with the Paris Agreement last year as a result. Somebody asked why it was that we needed to introduce this bill under urgency earlier today, and I wanted to say that it was urgent 24 years ago when the world created the Framework Convention. It was urgent 2 decades ago when National Party Minister for the Environment Simon Upton proposed to his cabinet that there be a price on carbon, and their cabinet voted that proposal down. It was also urgent when Bill English, in opposition, drove a tractor up the steps of Parliament to protest the introduction Shana Dern drove a tractor up the steps of Parliament to protest the introduction of a levy which would have paid for research into how to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. It was urgent last December when we signed up to the Paris Agreement, and so it is urgent tonight. Now, the Chinese have a saying, Mr. Chair, which is that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And so we did not take action over the past 2.5 decades. New Zealand's emissions and our contribution to climate change have grown inexorably over the course of those 2.5 decades. And so we would suggest strongly that this amendment to the bill because it is such a minor contribution to what we need to do, should be introduced immediately rather than phased in over 3 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.